The wind howled across the empty plains of La Mancha. Far away from the great cities of Spain, hidden among dry fields and silent roads, stood a small, forgotten village where nothing extraordinary ever happened. But inside one old house, a dangerous dream was slowly being born. There lived a man named Alonso Quijano. He was thin, poor, quiet, the kind of man people barely noticed. By day, he walked slowly through the village like a shadow. By night, he disappeared into books, not ordinary books. Stories of legendary knights, stories of warriors fighting giants, saving kingdoms, rescuing princesses, and battling evil with shining swords beneath stormy skies. Alonso read them endlessly. Every candle he owned melted beside those pages. Every coin he had disappeared into buying more stories. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and slowly, the line between reality and fantasy began to disappear. At first, the villagers laughed. "Alonso has lost his mind," they whispered. But they did not know how serious it had become. Because one night, the old man stood up from his chair with fire in his eyes and said the words that would change his life forever. "The world no longer has knights, so I shall become one." Silence filled the house. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Alonso walked toward an old storage room buried in dust and cobwebs. Inside were forgotten pieces of armor that had belonged to his ancestors many years ago. Rust covered the metal. The helmet was cracked. The chest plate barely fit his body. But when Alonso touched the armor, he did not see broken scraps. He saw destiny. Slowly, carefully, he placed the armor onto his body. The metal creaked with every movement. Then he looked into the mirror, and for the first time in many years, the weak old man disappeared. In his place stood a knight, a hero, a warrior chosen by fate itself. But every knight needed a noble steed. So Alonso searched for a horse. Unfortunately, the only animal he owned was an old skinny horse that looked one step away from death. Its ribs showed through its skin. Its legs trembled when it walked, but Alonso stared at the creature proudly. "You are no ordinary horse," he declared. "From this day forward, your name shall be Rocinante." The horse sneezed weakly, but in Alonso's imagination, it was the greatest war horse in all of Spain. Then came the final step. A knight needed a new name, a legendary name. He thought for hours, until finally, he smiled. "I am Don Quixote, Don Quixote of La Mancha." The name echoed through the silent room like prophecy. But there was still one thing missing. Every great knight fought in the name of a beautiful lady. And so Don Quixote chose a simple village woman named Aldonza Lorenzo. In reality, she was an ordinary farm girl who probably never even looked at him twice. But inside his fantasy, she became a magnificent princess, a queen of beauty and grace, and he renamed her Dulcinea. The next morning, before the sun fully rose, Don Quixote climbed onto Rocinante and rode out of the village. The armor rattled loudly. The horse stumbled across the road. Villagers stared in confusion as the strange old man disappeared into the horizon. Some laughed, some pitied him. Others crossed themselves in fear, because deep down, they felt something unsettling. The man truly believed he was a knight, and somewhere far ahead on the lonely roads of Spain, madness and adventure were waiting for him. The sun burned high above the empty roads of Spain. Dust rose beneath Rocinante's weak hooves as Don Quixote continued his journey across the endless plains. His armor groaned with every movement. His stomach was empty. His throat was dry. But none of that mattered. Because in his mind, he was no longer an old man wandering alone. He was a legendary knight riding toward destiny. Hour after hour, he searched the horizon for danger, for monsters, for evil kings, for helpless people needing rescue. But the world around him remained painfully ordinary. Until finally, as evening approached, he saw it. Far away in the distance stood a large building beside the road. Its walls glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Smoke rose into the sky. Voices echoed from inside. Don Quixote's eyes widened. At last, he whispered, a mighty castle. In reality, it was nothing more than a small roadside inn. The roof was damaged. The wooden walls were old and crooked. Travelers sat outside eating soup beside tired horses. But Don Quixote saw none of that. To him, the inn became a grand fortress guarded by noble lords. Even the two women standing near the entrance, ordinary workers laughing together, transformed inside his imagination into elegant royal ladies. Don Quixote climbed down from Rocinante with dramatic slowness. The rusty armor nearly fell apart. The women stared at him for a moment, then burst into laughter. But Don Quixote bowed respectfully. "Fear not, noble ladies," he said proudly. "A knight has arrived to protect this castle." The women laughed even harder. Inside the inn, travelers turned to watch the strange figure standing outside like a ghost from another century. Then the innkeeper appeared. He was a large man with clever eyes and a beard touched with gray. The moment he saw Don Quixote, he understood immediately. The old man had completely lost his mind, but instead of chasing him away, the innkeeper decided to enjoy the entertainment, so he gave a respectful bow and said, "Welcome, brave knight, to my castle." Don Quixote nearly trembled with happiness. Someone finally understood who he truly was. He entered proudly while the guests whispered and laughed behind his back. Inside, the inn smelled of smoke, meat, sweat, and wine. But to Don Quixote, it looked like the grand dining halls of kings. He sat stiffly at a table while servants brought him food. Unfortunately, his helmet was tied so tightly around his head that he could barely eat. The women tried to help him remove it, but the knots would not open. So Don Quixote attempted to drink soup through a tiny opening in the metal helmet. The entire room struggled not to laugh. Yet the night remained completely serious. As night covered the land, Don Quixote approached the innkeeper with deep determination. "My lord," he said, "there is one thing I still require." The innkeeper raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Don Quixote placed one hand dramatically on his chest. "I have not yet been officially knighted." For a moment, the innkeeper nearly exploded with laughter. But then a mischievous idea entered his mind. He decided to continue the game. "Very well," he said solemnly. "Tonight, you shall become a true knight." Don Quixote's eyes filled with emotion. At last, his destiny was becoming real. The innkeeper instructed him to perform an ancient knightly tradition. He must guard his armor through the night in the courtyard, and so, beneath the cold moonlight, Don Quixote stood beside a water trough, holding his rusty lance like a sacred weapon. Hours passed. The night grew darker. Travelers moved around him nervously. But the old man never lowered his guard. Then suddenly, a mule driver approached the water trough to let his animals drink. Without warning, Don Quixote shouted, "Stand back, villain! Touch not the sacred armor of a knight." The confused driver ignored him. A terrible mistake. With one violent swing, Don Quixote struck the man to the ground. Chaos erupted instantly. The courtyard exploded into confusion. The mule driver crashed onto the ground with a cry of pain, while buckets of water spilled across the dirt. For one frozen second, everyone stared at Don Quixote in disbelief. The old man stood proudly beside his armor beneath the moonlight, gripping his lance like a warrior defending a kingdom. "Let this be a warning," he shouted. "None shall dishonor the weapons of Don Quixote." The travelers could hardly believe what they were seeing. Some thought he was drunk, others thought he was possessed, but before anyone could react, another mule driver stormed forward angrily. "You crazy old fool!" He reached toward the armor, and once again, Don Quixote attacked. The lance swung through the air with surprising force. The second man collapsed beside the first. Now the courtyard descended into complete madness. Men grabbed stones. Horses panicked. Women screamed from the windows above. Someone shouted, "He's insane!" Another yelled, "Kill him before he kills someone else." But Don Quixote felt no fear. In his imagination, this was the glorious battle he had always dreamed about. The moonlight became battlefield fire. The angry travelers transformed into evil enemies. And he, Don Quixote of La Mancha, stood alone against overwhelming darkness. Stones flew through the air. One struck his shoulder, another hit his helmet with a loud metallic crack. Still he refused to retreat. "Cowards!" he roared. "Face me honorably." Inside the inn, the innkeeper realized the situation was spiraling out of control. What began as harmless fun was becoming dangerous. If the fight continued, someone might truly die. So the innkeeper rushed outside, waving his arms. "Stop! Stop!" Slowly, the chaos settled. The wounded mule drivers groaned on the ground, while furious travelers demanded punishment, but the innkeeper raised both hands dramatically and shouted, "This knight has completed the ancient trial." Don Quixote froze. The trial. Of course. Everything suddenly made sense inside his fantasy. The innkeeper stepped forward with forced seriousness, while trying desperately not to laugh. He carried an old book in one hand and a rusty sword in the other. The travelers watched silently, confused by the absurd scene unfolding before them. Then, beneath the pale moonlight, the innkeeper touched Don Quixote's shoulders with the sword. "By the powers granted to me," he declared, "I officially name you a knight." For a moment, the entire world became silent. Don Quixote lowered his head slowly. His dream had finally become reality, no longer merely a man pretending to be a knight. He now believed himself chosen by destiny itself. When the ceremony ended, Don Quixote climbed onto Rocinante proudly. The horse nearly collapsed beneath him. The travelers moved aside carefully, wanting the strange old man gone as quickly as possible. But before leaving, Don Quixote raised his lance toward the sky. "The weak shall be protected," he proclaimed. "The wicked shall fear my name." Then he rode away into the darkness. The innkeeper watched him disappear across the empty road, and for the first time that night, the laughter faded from his face. Because deep inside, he felt something unsettling. The old man's madness looked ridiculous, but there was also something strangely tragic about it. A lonely man who wanted so badly to become a hero that he abandoned reality itself. Far ahead on the road, Don Quixote smiled beneath his cracked helmet. At last, the world had its night again, and somewhere beyond the horizon, his first true adventure was waiting. Morning arrived slowly across the plains of La Mancha. Golden sunlight stretched over the hills while Don Quixote rode proudly along the dusty road. His body ached from the fight at the inn. His armor was dented, his horse looked exhausted, but inside his mind, he felt victorious. At last, he had become a true knight. Now his mission could finally begin. He rode for hours beneath the burning sun, searching for injustice wherever evil might hide. Then suddenly, he heard it. A cry, weak, painful, somewhere beyond the trees ahead. Don Quixote immediately pulled Rocinante to a stop. Again the cry echoed through the air, a child's voice, and beneath it, another sound, the sharp crack of a whip. Don Quixote's eyes narrowed. At last, he whispered, evil reveals itself. He kicked Rocinante forward and charged through the trees. What he discovered filled him with fury. A young farm boy, no older than 15, was tied to a tree with ropes around his wrists. His shirt was torn. His face was stained with tears and dirt. Standing before him was a farmer holding a whip. Each strike made the boy cry out in pain. To Don Quixote, the scene looked like pure villainy from the stories he loved. Without hesitation, he lowered his lance dramatically. Stop at once, coward. The farmer jumped in shock. The boy lifted his head weakly. Don Quixote rode closer, armor rattling loudly. How dare you torture the helpless, he thundered. Release the boy immediately. The farmer blinked in confusion at the strange night before him. This is none of your business, he snapped. The boy works for me. He loses my sheep and lies constantly. The frightened boy shook his head desperately. He refuses to pay me, the boy cried. He beats me instead. Don Quixote's face darkened with righteous anger. Inside his imagination, this was exactly the kind of evil knights were born to destroy. He pointed his lance directly at the farmer's chest. Untie him, Don Quixote ordered, or prepare to face justice. The farmer looked at the rusty armor, the skinny horse, the trembling old man behind the helmet, and decided it was safer not to argue. Slowly, angrily, he cut the ropes. The boy collapsed to the ground in pain. Don Quixote sat proudly atop Rocinante like a conquering hero. Now, he declared, you will pay the boy every coin you owe him. The farmer forced a smile. Of course, noble knight. I shall pay him everything. Don Quixote nodded with satisfaction. Justice had been restored. The world truly needed him. He looked down at the boy kindly. Fear no more, he said. You have been protected by Don Quixote of La Mancha. The boy stared silently, uncertain whether his rescuer was brave or completely insane. But Don Quixote saw gratitude in his eyes anyway. Satisfied with his heroic victory, the knight turned Rocinante back toward the road. As he disappeared into the distance, the farmer's fake smile slowly vanished, his face twisted with rage. The moment Don Quixote could no longer be seen, the farmer grabbed the boy violently. Because of you, he hissed, I'll beat you twice as hard now. The boy screamed, but far away on the open road. Don Quixote continued smiling proudly beneath the bright Spanish sky, completely unaware that his attempt to save the boy had only made things worse. The road stretched endlessly beneath the blazing afternoon sun. Don Quixote rode forward proudly, believing his legend was already growing across Spain. In his imagination, villagers would soon speak his name beside kings and heroes. Children would dream of becoming knights like him. Songs would be written about his courage. But reality remained cruelly different. Dust covered his armor. Rocinante limped weakly beneath him, and most people who passed him simply stared in confusion. Hours later, Don Quixote spotted a group of travelers approaching from the opposite side of the road. They were merchants from Toledo, riding mules loaded with cloth and supplies. Beside them walked several servants carrying bags and wooden staffs. Ordinary men, tired travelers. But inside Don Quixote's mind, they became wandering nobles crossing the kingdom. This, he decided, was the perfect moment to prove his greatness. He pulled Rocinante into the center of the road and raised his lance dramatically. "Halt!" The merchant slowed in surprise. Dust drifted through the hot air. One of the merchants frowned. "What does this old man want?" Don Quixote lifted his chin proudly. "Before you continue," he announced loudly, "you must confess that the Lady Dulcinea of Toboso is the most beautiful woman in all the world." The merchants exchanged confused glances. One servant began laughing quietly. Another whispered, "He's mad." But Don Quixote's expression remained deadly serious. "Speak the truth now," he demanded, "or prepare yourselves for battle." The merchants could hardly believe what they were hearing. Finally, one of them decided to mock him for amusement. "Very well," the merchant replied carefully. "Show us this lady first. If she is truly beautiful, we shall praise her gladly." A dangerous mistake. Don Quixote's eyes burned with outrage. "Her beauty is beyond question," he shouted. "True knights believe without needing proof." Now several merchants openly laughed. Even the servants struggled to contain themselves. But to Don Quixote, their laughter sounded like insults against his sacred lady, against honor itself. Slowly, he lowered his lance toward them. "Then, defend yourselves." And with that, Don Quixote kicked Rocinante forward into battle. Unfortunately, Rocinante was neither fast nor heroic. After only a few awkward steps, the exhausted horse stumbled over a rock. Horse and rider crashed violently into the dirt. The lance snapped. Dust exploded everywhere. For a moment, silence covered the road. Then the merchants burst into uncontrollable laughter. Don Quixote struggled desperately beneath the heavy armor, unable to stand. Still, even lying helpless in the dirt, he continued shouting, "Cowards, face me honorably." One servant approached angrily and struck Don Quixote with part of the broken lance, again and again, until the wood shattered completely. The merchants finally ordered the servant to stop before the old man was seriously injured. Then they continued their journey down the road, still laughing about the strange encounter. Soon, Don Quixote lay alone beneath the burning sun, bruised, bleeding, unable to rise. But even now, his mind refused to surrender the fantasy, because in his imagination, he had not lost a foolish fight against merchants, no. He had survived a glorious battle against powerful enemies, and somewhere deep inside the old man's broken heart, the dream of becoming a true hero still burned brighter than ever. The sun slowly crossed the sky above the empty plains. Don Quixote remained lying in the dust, unable to move beneath the weight of his armor. Pain burned through every part of his body. His ribs ached, his hands trembled. Even Rocinante stood nearby looking miserable and confused. Yet somehow, the old knight still whispered proudly to himself, "Great battles require great suffering." Wind swept across the lonely road. For hours, no one passed. No armies, no kings, no magical enemies, only silence. Then at last, the sound of wheels creaking approached from the distance. A farmer riding a small cart appeared along the road. The man squinted ahead and suddenly froze. There, sprawled in the dirt like a fallen statue, lay a knight in broken armor. The farmer climbed down carefully, and the moment he saw the man's face, his eyes widened. Alonso? It was one of Don Quixote's neighbors from the village. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The old man's armor was bent. His helmet was cracked. Dust covered his face. But the strangest thing of all was the smile still lingering on his lips. The farmer knelt beside him. "What happened to you?" Don Quixote tried to sit up proudly, but failed instantly. Still, he forced his voice to sound heroic. "I have fought mighty warriors," he whispered dramatically. "Such wounds are the destiny of knights." The farmer sighed heavily. Everyone in the village already suspected Alonso had lost his mind. Now there was no doubt. Without arguing, the farmer carefully lifted Don Quixote onto the cart. The armor clanged loudly with every movement. Rocinante followed weakly behind them as they began the slow journey back home. As the cart rolled across the plains, Don Quixote stared at the clouds above. Even after humiliation, even after pain, his imagination refused to die. Inside his mind, he was not a defeated old fool returning home, no. He was a wounded champion, recovering after glorious combat. And so he began inventing explanations for his defeat. "A powerful magician must have interfered," he muttered. "Yes. Dark sorcery changed the outcome of battle." The farmer shook his head silently. He realized something terrifying. Don Quixote no longer merely enjoyed fantasy stories. He was trapped inside them. By sunset, they finally reached the village. People stopped working as the cart entered the streets. Women stared from windows. Children pointed and laughed nervously. Men whispered among themselves. There he was, the strange old man who left pretending to be a knight, now returning bruised and half-conscious. Soon, Don Quixote's house filled with worried faces. Among them were the village priest, the barber, and his housekeeper. All of them feared the same thing. The books had poisoned his mind. The priest examined the armor grimly. "If this madness continues," he said quietly, "he may destroy himself completely." That night, while Don Quixote slept exhausted in bed, his friends made a serious decision. They entered his library carrying candles. Shelf after shelf surrounded them. Hundreds of books about knights, monsters, battles, and heroic adventures. The very stories that had transformed Alonso Quijano into Don Quixote. The priest looked around slowly. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. "These books are the enemy, one by one." They began pulling the books from the shelves, and outside, thunder rumbled across the dark Spanish sky once again. Outside the house, the night wind howled through the silent streets of the village. Inside, Don Quixote slept deeply for the first time in days. His bruised body rested beneath heavy blankets while candlelight flickered across the walls. But in the next room, something unforgettable was about to happen. The priest stood before the giant shelves of books with a grim expression. The barber crossed his arms nervously. Don Quixote's housekeeper whispered, "Those stories destroyed his mind." Hundreds of books filled the room. Stories of knights, wars, magic, giants. legends that had slowly consumed Alonso Quijano's reality piece by piece. The priest picked up one old book and sighed heavily. "If we do nothing," he said quietly, "his madness will only grow worse." Then slowly, the books were carried outside, armful after armful, until a giant pile formed beneath the dark sky. The villagers gathered silently nearby, watching with unease. Some pitied the old man, others feared him, and some simply laughed at the strange tragedy unfolding before them. Then the priest lowered a torch. Fire exploded into the night. Flames climbed greedily across the books. Pages curled black beneath the heat. Smoke rose toward the moonlit sky like dying memories. Inside the house, Don Quixote suddenly opened his eyes. For a moment, he stared into the darkness. Then he heard it, the crackling of flames outside. He slowly stood from his bed despite the pain. His armor rested nearby like a sleeping ghost, and as the firelight flickered through the window, a terrible feeling filled his chest. He stumbled toward the door. But before he could leave, the housekeeper blocked his path. "Rest, Alonso," she pleaded softly. But Don Quixote looked at her with confusion. "Where are my books?" No one answered. Outside, the flames roared higher. And in that moment, Don Quixote understood. His enemies had attacked while he was weak, not ordinary enemies. No, dark magicians. Evil sorcerers determined to destroy the world of knights forever. His eyes slowly burned with fury. Not fear, not sadness. Fury. Because the fire outside did not kill his dream. It only made it stronger. Don Quixote turned toward the darkness and whispered, "You may burn the stories, but you cannot burn the night." The flames continued rising into the Spanish night. Because the fire outside did not kill his dream, it only made it stronger. Don Quixote turned toward the darkness and whispered, "You may burn the stories, but you cannot burn the night." The flames continued rising into the Spanish night, and somewhere deep inside the old man's fractured mind, a new adventure was already beginning. The Night of La Mancha will return.